Good morning and welcome to the Whitall Pavilion in the Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress here in Washington, D.C. My name is Matthew Barton. I'm the recorded sound curator for the Library of Congress, and I'm only in D.C. occasionally. Most of the time I'm down in Culpeper, Virginia, which is the home of the library's National Audiovisual Conservation Center, or the NAVCC. But my career at the library did start here in this building, actually, in the American Folklife Center in 2003. So it is nice to be back. And this is, I think, a very special pair of events. This first one, a day-long series of panels on the subject of audiobooks. And obviously, the Library of Congress has a lot of books. And some of them are audiobooks or talking books. And because they are recordings, well, they are, that's part of my job, is looking after those, the audiobooks. You know, we've been collecting them, not quite as long as we've been collecting music, but collecting them a long time. And the recording of the spoken word goes back to the earliest recordings. And, you know, throughout the 78 RPM era, you did have people recording poems and famous passages of books, but you really couldn't do a whole book on a series of 78 RPM discs. It would take about 100 just for a short book, probably. But the talking book program, which we're going to hear about in this presentation, was something that the library played a very important role in the 1930s. And so in a very real sense, the library and the NLS, the American Federation for the Blind, and others, very much, you know, the parents of the modern audiobook. So in this panel, I'm joined by three people from NLS, Kristen Fernikes, Alice O'Reilly, and Laura Generelli. And I will let each of them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what they do. And they've prepared a historical presentation that we'll be looking at. And we have lots to talk about in the next hour. So, Kristen.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Good, wonderful. So I am Kristen Fernikes, as Matthew's just said. I am the head of communications and outreach at National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled. So this is an excellent opportunity for me to share a little bit of information about the wonderful work that we do here. I'm used to talking to people about NLS, but it's always a pleasure to help people better understand what we do.
And my name is Alice O'Reilly. I'm the chief of the collections division at the National Library Service. We're in charge of collecting all of the content that we add to our collection, that we circulate to our network of cooperating libraries to be provided to our patrons. It's a really great program. It's really fantastic. Its historical origins are fascinating, but we continue to, you know, strive to create interesting content for people who otherwise wouldn't have access.
And I'm Laura Generelli. I'm a narrator, monitor, reviewer in the recording studio, the Media Lab at the National Library Service for the Blind. I've been working there essentially most of my adult life, narrating audiobooks and helping to make talking books back when the commercial talking book world was still in its infancy. NLS was busy producing audiobooks for its patrons, both at NLS and in a number of contract studios around the country. So NLS really did sort of lay the groundwork for what is now the commercial talking book world.
Great, thank you. Well, so NLS is certainly well known to its user base, but much less so to the rest of the country and the rest of the audiobook user base. So perhaps you could start by just telling us what is the NLS and how did it get started?
Sure. So
and tell me when you want to see a slide.
Yeah, I was going to say, okay, now I can see the slides. So NLS is the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled. We serve individuals who, for one reason or another, cannot access regular print materials. So people with disabilities like blindness, low vision, physical disability that would prevent someone from holding a book or turning a page, or someone with a reading disability would also be eligible for our service. And one thing that I want to bring up, because it's actually very relevant to our history, is we have a focus on serving veterans. So veterans who might have a traumatic brain injury or CTE, we're also very interested in making sure that our services is available to them. As far as where we came from and how we came to be, NLS started in 1931, and with the intent of providing Braille material. So we weren't to audio yet, but we were providing hard copy Braille materials to blind adults. As I just referenced with veterans, there was a great interest within Congress when we were starting out and when they were looking at appropriating money for our program to serve individuals who had come back from World War I who had lost their vision. There was a lot of people who came back and had lost their vision in World War I, and Congress was looking for ways to be of assistance to them. So I see the slide that you have up there. I do want to point out that the library actually has a long-standing interest in serving people who are blind. So even before NLS existed, the library had a reading room for the blind as late as the 1800s. So again, this is something that the library had been interested in. But in 1931, when we started, that expanded service to people around the country. The reading room was fantastic, but it meant that you had to come to Washington, D.C. or be in close proximity in order to make use of those materials. So that's kind of how we started out and what we were doing initially.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, it took a few years to get off the ground, but I think the connection to, the modern audiobook is a very strong one, although obviously there are differences between an NLS talking book and a modern audiobook. But this was really, as I say, even though people had recorded poems and literary selections before this, this is really the first sustained effort to present complete works.
Right.
Narrated professionally, for for a regular dedicated user base.
Right. So in and around 1934, there was an interest for us to look at using new technology to be able to share audio books with people. I have to step back just a little bit because this technology began much earlier. Obviously, Thomas Edison, when he came up with the phonograph, was very, very interested. One of his top reasons for pursuing that technology was because he believed that it would be helpful for people who were blind. One of his associates, Frank Dyer, who actually oddly was his patent attorney, so it was sort of a strange person to be innovating, but he did. So 78 records were very common at the time. Unfortunately, though, as you pointed out, they only held about 3 to 5 minutes of recorded sound on each side. So you can imagine trying to get a book if you could only do 3 to 5 minutes. Plus, that would be really not a very fun listening experience. So Frank Dyer looked at a way to improve on the 78 records. And what he did was he slowed down the RPMs to 33 1/3, and he moved the grooves closer together so that we could get a lot more time on each side. That is the long play record, so LPs. If anybody's ever listened to an LP, that's essentially where this has come from. Yes, I see clapping in the audience. We all love our LPs. And also, again, 3 to 5 minutes, just not long enough. So we piggybacked on that idea in cooperation with the American Foundation for the Blind, who had sought this technology out, asked whether or not we could go ahead and pursue it. So in 1934, when we got money to start to distribute audio, those were the records that we were putting out, and they were aptly called talking books. And there's a bunch of them out sitting on the table out there. I think Talking Books is such a lovely name, and we still use it. So we've progressed past this technology, obviously. We stopped producing records in 1987, but we still refer to them as talking books. So now that they're digital, or you could get it on an app on your smart device, it's still a talking book to us. And it's nice. It's a nice name because I think everybody understands it.
Right.
The book is talking to you, right?
And Stevie Wonder immortalized it with the name of one of his albums.
Exactly. So again, we didn't do it alone. We did it with the American Foundation for the Blind. The AFB worked with the WPA to build our very first record players, which are also spectacular looking. We have one at the back of the room also. It's supposed to be portable. I don't know about that.
It's movable.
That's right, exactly. It is movable, yes, but for everybody in this room who's actually moved that today, I would say that it's not necessarily the most portable thing in the world. But it is beautiful. It was durable. The intent is that people could be able to get them for very low cost, or eventually we loaned them to them long term. And then we were sending these big record packs out to people. We do have a slide a little bit later, but I was interested to see, though, that even though we could fit more sound on one side, Gone with the Wind was still 80 records. Yeah. So, yeah, that's a lot.
Okay. Great.
And it might be worth mentioning they go through the postal system.
They do.
So-
We sort of joke at the office that we're pretty sure that the USPS was really pleased when we stopped distributing things on records. They're not light, but they were made. You know, with the switch from 78s, they also went to a vinyl composite to make them more durable. Because of course, anybody who's ever seen 78s anywhere, you know that they're really very brittle.
They're made of shellac primarily.
Shellac, right, exactly. So, you know, that was another step toward durability, accessibility, so that we could circulate these recordings over and over again.
And they go through the postal system free.
Yes.
The patrons don't pay for it. It's got a stamp on it that says free matter for the blind and disabled, I guess now.
Right.
But yeah, they don't pay for it. They borrow a book and it comes to them, and when they're done, they send it back.
No question.
Right. So 1934 sees the first talking books are released, and I know part of the answer to this question because I've seen some of the early book lists. It's a range of material, some of which are pretty obvious that people might guess, but some that are less obvious.
Right. It was all kinds of different things. I was always interested to find out that one of the first things that we distributed was the Declaration of Independence, which, again, we also have here today, the talking book of the Declaration of Independence. Maybe we would do well to have lots of people listening to the Declaration of Independence. I don't know. Exactly. We'll re-release it. But then, of course, there was classics. We had Shakespeare. There was more modern things. Mark Twain. I'm trying to think of who else. All kinds of things that you would see that would be popular during the 30s, which again, I think is interesting because when people ask us about our collection now, it's a very different collection than the rest of the Library of Congress. We're collecting things that are contemporary and relevant now to readers, and that was the same way that collections were put together in 1930.
We've always been a collection that kind of reflects recreational reading, less so like vocational or training or something like that. But it's really pleasure reading. You know, it's things that you'll enjoy listening to. It's things that lend themselves to a storytelling. And I think that's one of the reasons that our human voice narration has always been so popular is that, you know, that's what we're creating. We're creating this experience in an audio format.
One book I noticed on an early list, though, was I can't remember the man's name. He was very well known at the time. He was the reptile handler for the Bronx Zoo, and he was something of a celebrity.
Yeah,
you know, he
of
appeared
course.
in silent movies, you know, holding up a crocodile or something. And you know, he was quite well known, and he published a book. And
I'm sure we
there
have a
it is.
modern,
There's
version of the crocodile.
It's an early
handler.
talking book.
Yeah, trust me.
Yeah.
Writing this down?
I am. Notes to
that's
self.
right,
Yeah,
there's-
exactly.
There's real
Should take a
possibility
note.
in that.
But that's true. We do reflect kind of what people are interested in reading. You know, sometimes collections can be prescriptive. You know, like you should read read these things. But we really do want to make sure that people have access to the materials that they want to read in the format that they prefer. And so our collection reflects those interests.
Yeah.
Yes,
Archives and all.
I will say, as one of the narrators who's worked there for 40-plus years, my definition of recreational reading may be different than yours. I have narrated a lot of books over the years that it's like, wow, someone really is going to listen to this for pleasure? I mean, we've read a lot of pretty dense material. I remember
very
reading a book about
sophisticated
archaeology that was like very, very challenging to narrate, but, you know, out there somewhere is someone who that's their, you know, favorite evening reading is to listen to a book about
And the nice
discovering
thing,
Naxos and all the...
and you got all the pronunciations right.
Oh, yes.
Right? The work that goes into these, you can
Oh, yes.
count on that whatever
Yeah.
was narrated was accurate, so there's not
Yes.
going to be any mispronunciations.
Yeah.
No one will be embarrassed at a cocktail party talking about archaeology because they didn't know how to pronounce it.
Yes.
Well, another one I noticed on an early list, the title just jumped out at me. The title of the book is These Crazy Electrons by Raymond Yates, I think is the name of the writer. And, you know, I was just intrigued, so I started digging into it. Well, he was a popular science writer, wrote a number of books. You know, this being the Library of Congress, I was able to get a copy to look at. And it's actually a very, you know, engaging and funny writer on scientific topics. And he sneaks in a plug for the NLS because he's talking about innovations in recording in the mid-30s. So,
We need that with tactile graphics. That would be great. Okay, that's right.
You got to finally learn.
Exactly.
right. So we talked about how people got the material from the post office, but more generally, you know, how did people find out about it? How, because it sounded, we were talking about this earlier, it seemed in the beginning a very informal thing, but it was some people just loved this idea.
Absolutely. Well, and I should say that we today work with a network of libraries to distribute our materials. But even in 1931, we started out with, I want to say it was like 20 libraries around the country, libraries and schools. Not all of the entities with whom we work are libraries themselves, other institutions. But what's so fantastic is we have maintained those relationships since 1931, and we are still working with those same libraries today. So they are integral to what we do, and inform us regularly, you know, about what they'd like to see, what they're hearing from people. And a number of them also have their own studios. So they may also be recording things that are relevant locally, which really helps us grow our collection that way. But yes, so right off the bat, as soon as we got the appropriation, there was a number of entities around the country that stepped forward and said, let us help you, let us work with you. And we can't do that work that we do today or then without those other groups.
Yeah. So I've looked at your PowerPoint a couple of times, but you probably have it memorized. Should I advance the
Sure,
slide?
go
We have a
ahead,
good-
we can talk through
Another
those
good
a
one?
little bit.
Okay. All right. Okay. There we are, 1931.
1931. So this was the Pratt-Smoot Act, which was which was the first appropriation. One thing that was really interesting about this, I will say, we have had the pleasure of going back and looking at the debates in Congress about how this was going to be funded, what was going to happen. And it wasn't a foregone conclusion that the Library of Congress would have actually been doing this. There were a number of agencies and entities within the federal government who were equally interested in undertaking this, again, for all the reasons that we were talking about, interested in helping people who were blind, interested in helping people who were veterans. But eventually it was settled on that it would be at the Library of Congress because we were good at selecting books.
Still are, actually.
And
We're
so
very
it
good at
wasn't,
that.
it wasn't just about, making the Braille and getting it out. It had to have content. And so, we seem like a logical choice from that standpoint. But if you ever have any interest, reading the debates are actually quite intriguing.
But it's very important, though, because at the time, they were simply, it's a new kind of book,
Right.
but they are books.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, that's when we were just doing Braille, so that was in 1931. So I'm trying to remember what the next slide is.
Okay.
Matt can show you.
Right. So this is a picture, and again, you'll recognize the device that these individuals are all sitting around because we have one at the back of the room. But this is, this is a group of people who are enjoying one of our talking books. And we do know that at some of our libraries, that this is the way that people may have accessed it. People may have actually come in and listened to our books in those libraries. But I just love this story because everybody's leaning in and or love this picture because everybody's leaning in and very interested and engaged, just exactly the way that you want people to enjoy a book.
Yeah, but it also reflects one of the unique facets of the talking books. A group could listen to it and experience it all in real time. And even if these people probably knew each other, but even if they didn't, at the end of it, they have something in common that they can talk about.
Exactly, the very first book club.
Yeah. I'm going to write that down. That's good. Okay.
You've got a question?
Well, I'm just going to make a comment in that the serialization process, so back when Dickens was writing, or Twain for that matter, and a serial newspaper or story was going out that way, that's often exactly what was happening. One person would buy the paper, they'd take it to their storyteller, everybody else who couldn't afford the newspaper would gather around, and that person would tell the story. So in a sense,
Yeah.
Right.
And I think it's worth mentioning that that was something that made the transition to radio in the early days. You did have programs that were simply readings. Again, it would, be, it might not be a full book or a story, but, passages and poems and so on. And these were very popular programs. There is still some of that on the radio. I mean, I'm from Boston. WGBH radio had for many years, from the 50s, I think up until 2000, a man named Bill Cavness, who was a wonderful narrator. He was just a regular presence on the radio. And even today, there's I think it's Wisconsin Public Radio, maybe someone can, chapter a day, which is just that, 5 days a week, a chapter a day from a book. I think they have five, and I think each day has a particular narrator too. It's not just one person. Yeah. Okay. Shall I advance?
Sure.
Okay.
So this is a label of one of our early talking books. It's the one that I referred to a little bit earlier, Gone with the Wind, and 80 records, and a very angry Postal Service employee who had to take that to people. But you'll see that it says on it, solely for the use of the blind. Because again, this was patented technology. And that technology was given specifically to AFB and then by extension to us. So these were not to be used by other people. Of course, it wasn't until, I believe, after World War II that the LP was more largely.
And there are also copyrighted materials too, so I think that that's something to mention.
I think that's very important.
Yeah.
Yes. So this was, you're not harming anyone's sales.
No.
You're not cutting into anyone's royalties.
We used to have
by
to get
doing this.
exceptions for each of the books that we did, but
Yeah.
most recently we've gotten a broader exception through the Chafee Amendment. But this would have had to have been requested to the publisher or to the copyright holder specifically.
In the early years of my working at NLS, we used to have to say, recorded or whatever, by permission of, and you used to have to say who had given permission, and then there was a particular year that I don't recall when the library no longer had to ask for permission and could record anything they wanted.
And I should say, too, that on the other side of this record, this is the printed label on one side, and then on the other side, that label would have been entirely in Braille.
Yeah. And if you look, I don't know how many people grabbed a program on the way in, and I just found this disc on our shelves in Culpeper the other day. There's an image of a label similar to that, and then the other side is a raised Braille label, and the record is actually, the speaker is Harry Hopkin who ran the WPA in the 1930s, and it's about the WPA's involvement in the whole program, which that greatly expanded the talking book.
That was exactly what I was going to ask, was how was the WPA's work? People like
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, initially what we were doing was books. So in all likelihood, not so much. But we did, eventually we've moved on to other things. We do magazines now, which Alice may talk a little bit about in just a second. To your point about, more up-to-date or, information that is more like sort of current and immediate, I was intrigued to see that at that point when we started to do magazines, we were actually doing them more on flexi discs as opposed to rigid discs because they were considered to be somewhat throwaway. So, we were looking eventually to produce materials that were not books, but technology changed a little bit when we were doing that.
Well, but she was out recording in the 30s, during the.
And it's actually a different part of the Library of Congress. At that time, that is what's now the American Folklife Center. But at that time, it was the Archive of American Folk Song, which was part of the music division at that time. And this is where the Lomaxes and others, the archive was started by Robert Winslow Gordon in the late 20s. And those are the field recording activities, where they're going out in different parts of the country, recording songs, but also stories and oral histories from people. And while texts were published in print, the records were not issued until, I believe, 1942. But again, they used the network of public libraries. These were records you could hear at your public library. You could order one from the Library of Congress, but more likely you were going to go to your public library and hear it there. But that was the first real distribution of any of those field recordings. Yeah. So, you mentioned you stayed with records for a long time. Got it?
We're still
was
very
try-
sad that we've moved away from records.
It's tried and true, though,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's maybe you should think about it because, the major labels thought they were done with vinyl,
No.
and but they discovered that it sells again. So maybe.
They are not, that's right, exactly. Right, but we did eventually move on from records. And as I understand it, there was a period of time, about 20 years, where we did both cassettes and records. After diligent
It wasn't 20 years.
investigation.
No, it was only about, when we distributed books on both cassette and digitally, was only about 5 years or so. Oh, you're talking about records.
Right,
I'm sorry.
right.
Transitions.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
brain
Now,
fart.
again, those cassettes wouldn't play
No,
in a typical cassette player. It's another proprietary format.
right. Do you want to talk a little bit about cassettes?
Cassettes? Well, I think we can share cassettes across.
Yeah,
the-
okay.
Yeah, so we transitioned from record to cassette because technology was transitioning and because you've seen how portable the portable record player is. And, time marches on and people have different expectations from their library program. But similarly, the number of cassettes that would have been necessary to provide an entire talking book would have just been tremendous, and we really didn't want to do that. So we developed a very interesting cassette player, and we've got some out in the hallway for people who are in person today. That and maybe you can describe the technology better than I can, but there was 4 sides, and you had to learn a little bit because it wasn't exactly a regular cassette player. You couldn't just press go, but you would switch sides after halfway through. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And then you would, so you could basically get an entire book on just a couple of cassettes, which was something that was really nice and
Yeah,
convenient.
but they had 4 tracks, but I believe it ran at half the speed of a
Okay.
standard
Right,
cassette player.
it ran at half speed,
Yep.
and you would say, end of side 1. To continue, turn the cassette over, and you'd listen to side 2. And when you finish side 2, end of side 2, to continue, change the side selector switch and turn the cassette over. You would change a switch, and then it would listen, so that there were like 4 tracks, like my 4 fingers, and you'd listen to 1, 2, 3, and 4.
And
Laura
as I-
said that many times. I have a feeling.
Yes, I said that many times.
And as I understand it too, we played a little bit with different speeds on that as well, which I should say, going back to records, they tried to go to slower and slower speeds with the records too. Those were not widely adopted. But nonetheless, that was another
Yeah,
attempt.
returns do start to diminish
Right, right.
after a
But,
while.
you know, I think it's an interesting example, though, and it's something that we talk a lot about now as part of overall modernization for NLS. We have been working with using, optimizing, and piggybacking on technological advances literally since we started to try and find better and more efficient ways to deliver our service to people. So if anybody's interested, there's actually a great big book about NLS that has a lot of these details in it. And it's just amazing. I mean, we have engineers who are working very, very hard all the time. But again, going all the way back to the records and the cassettes and so on and so forth, looking for ways to fiddle with this technology and find a better way to.
At about the time that NLS takes advantage of the cassette format, books on tape appear. But they're, interestingly, you know, even though it's a standard cassette, they're doing something similar in that, you know, you don't own these tapes. You're borrowing them, you're renting them essentially. And I mean, I actually had a job in the early 90s in an office, and part of the job was mailing back the boss's tapes, you know. See, he had a long commute and, you know, would go through a lot of books. So.
Yeah, I think one of the exciting things about the technologies that we're constantly developing is, you know, we're taking cues from our patrons all the time. So sometimes I think patrons, especially if they've been in the program for a really long time and they're used to listening to their books, they might want to listen to them a little bit faster. You know, so listening to the record doesn't really allow for a lot of like deviation from the speed. But our cassette tapes let you speed up. And so you could listen to it just a little bit faster, even 0.5 faster. You're going to get through it faster, but you know, you can listen to something a little bit faster than you could perhaps read it. So we're always looking for ways that we can listen to what our patrons are saying, find out, you know, from people who are using the program, how it could be optimized, you know, like what technology should we explore. So it's really comes from the patron's experience that our optimizations are kind of rooted.
Yeah. Now you know, commercial audiobooks have become a very big business ever since, but going back to the books on tape days. And your NLS is now, you know, closer to that world than it has
They've
been
come
previously.
closer to us,
Well,
I
not
think, yeah.
or
And
there, yeah,
briefing
that's right.
time.
They've come over.
Let's establish the lines in the sand.
Well put. All right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who was first?
We know, we just went through that.
No argument about that. Yeah. But it's interesting though. I mean, if they're, you know, learn from your experience with what they record and how they record.
Yeah, I think that more and more people, more and more, you know, commercial studios are creating audiobooks. I think they have moved away from abridged titles, which is really nice, you know, realizing that people want to hear the whole thing. I think consumers have probably grown in their kind of willingness to listen to a whole book. You know, things have changed the way people kind of expect the materials to be produced, so they've kind of come again to the NLS standard of reading the entire, you know, print material. But I think that, you know, even though just another plug for NLS and its totality. I think that the difference between an audiobook and an accessible book cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what NLS produces. We might call them talking books, we might call them audiobooks, but essentially what we're making is accessible
Tell us
content.
about those differences.
Well, I think a primary difference is that, you know, Laura reads all the bits, not just the interesting ones.
Yeah, we read the footnotes, we read sidebars, and also our books. I mean, now in the digital universe, they're tremendously navigable. We do post-production on the book, which will be talked about in another panel later, but that allows the listener to navigate on either their smart device or the NLS digital player. They can skip a chapter, they can skip to the appendix and then come back. There are all kinds of ways that they can navigate the book. There's even one of my favorite features on the new digital player is you can set it, you know, like many people read before they go to sleep. You can set your player to play for like 20 minutes and then stop, so you can read yourself to sleep, and the book won't like play out to the end while you're sleeping. It only plays a section, so if you fell asleep before it stopped, you can back it up. Back in the early days, when I was a young narrator, the Media Lab was very much R&D, and we tested what was called tone indexing technology, which in the cassette world actually allowed listeners to skip ahead to the next chapter. You would put it in fast forward, and you would hear beep, beep, and that allowed you to skip, I would think principally in a nonfiction book, but maybe not, skip ahead to the next indexed section of the book, and that was something that, books on tape books did not do. Commercial talking books did not, but our books did. At one point, Bill West, who was an engineer at the library, he's still with us, but no longer at NLS, was testing different frequencies of tones in the hopes that you would be able, as we now do with the digital book, we can index the chapter, the section, the footnotes. We can index it on different levels, at level 1 this, at level 2 that, at level 3 this. In the cassette books, he was hoping to be able to have one frequency of tone for a chapter, another for a section, but most of our patrons, when they tested it, couldn't hear the difference between beep and beep, and so that was jettisoned. But we tested a lot of technology in the recording studio at NLS to see if they could improve the listener's navigation experience.
And I think that reflects our commitment to replicating the print book experience. We're really interested in making sure that no information is left behind, basically.
Yeah.
We make no decisions that say, oh, you wouldn't need this, don't worry about it. We read all of the footnotes and all of the comments and all of and they're created in a way where they're easy to understand, and you also get an idea about what that print book is. And I think there's even more in the commercial side, is that they're built for people who are print readers, but who prefer to read audio. But they'll never make a cookbook, an audio cookbook, right? Like, there'll never be a commercial audio cookbook. And we do that. We make these audio cookbooks for people who want to, know how to make something. But they're indexed at the ingredient level. So you can just jump through, go get the flour, come back, listen to the next ingredient, go get those eggs, come back.
You're reminding me, and I forgot to bring this in, because we have it in the collection, and my wife, Karen, that's a shout out to Karen. I hope you're tuning in.
I'm sure she's watching. Hello, Karen.
Who's great at finding things. I told her
other
about
things, I'm
this, and
sure,
she got me a
Karen.
copy of it. We have in the collection Vincent Price, the great actor, famous for his horror movies, was a gourmet cook. And he published 1 or 2 cookbooks, and he did, God bless him, he did an audio version of at least one of
Big
them.
seller, right?
And you haven't heard the word guacamole until you've heard Vincent Price say guacamole.
Oh my gosh, I've got to get that. That's good. That's a re-release. I know. God, so many things to find out. But I think also in the commercial industry, there's a lot of, let's say, supplements. So you might buy an audiobook, but then the recipes that go with that book, or the exercises, or the, graphs and charts, if it's a book about something that, is science-y, then they are accompanied in a PDF, and you can just download those and look at them, right? But, for our patrons, what we want to make sure is that they have access to that content, because if it's worth publishing, it's worth narrating. And so even though we do have wonderful relationship with a lot of commercial publishers, and we're so grateful for all the content that we're able to make available that way, our Media Lab is really instrumental in creating that accessible book, which is narrating that print content that's provided in a PDF format, and then knitting it to that commercial book, and then creating a truly accessible book. So, the efforts that the Media Lab and our other essentially narrating studios go through to make this content truly accessible can't be overstated. It's really an amazing thing. The markup itself is just outstanding. And like Laura said, you'll hear about it later today and be truly, inspired about the level of work, but also the level of innovation and technology and commitment that goes into making this content available. And we had talked about the record player and then the cassette player, but there's also a digital talking book machine and also an app that's associated with that as well. And it's the combination of those two things that really kind of highlights NLS's, I think, technical advances, but also commitments to our patron, and that we don't just provide the books, we provide the players as well. You know, we don't just provide content and then good luck getting it to play on something. You know, we make sure that you have what you need, and it comes to your house, and there's no limits to what you're able to have access to. So whether it's you're calling a network library to, you know, have them help you get your books, or you're going to download them yourself on Bard, however you want to get that, we're going to make sure that you have what you need to read what you want.
Right.
And that's a really critical piece to access for us.
Yeah, yeah. I had a note here that I needed to ask you about the future of the audiobook, but
So
I think
bright. It's so good.
you've really,
You know, the future is more, but it's better, it's more interesting, you know, it's discoverability, and people are seriously tired of hearing me say this, but I always say discoverability is the new accessibility, because you can have all the content in the world, but if you can't find it, then, you know, then that's really, you have nothing. So, you know, I think the future for the audiobook is helping people find more precisely what they're after, you know, finding more and more discovery tools, but also I think, you know, there's so much more that we can do that creates interesting content, and I think that we get a lot of great ideas from our patrons. You know, there's lots of great ways that we can kind of leverage Braille readers who also want to listen to audio, you know, where we can have content that has a tactile graphic that's available, which would be like an image in raised form, but then you might want to have the audio content that's associated with that. So NLS continues to kind of push the boundaries of what's kind of been traditionally made for people in the accessible area, but you know, it always comes back to our patrons. Our tactile graphic idea, we had a patron who was listening to a book on science, like maybe it was excitable electrons or something. And he said, wouldn't it be great to know what this picture looks like? You know, I'd love to have an image of this. And I thought, oh, of course you would. What a great idea. So, you know, I would encourage any patron who's listening or any librarian who's listening, if you have an idea that you think could improve our program, you know, if you think that you have an aha moment, please, you know, reach out to me directly. I'd love to know what you think is possible, and you know what you think is doable, and what you think would enhance our program, because all of our great ideas come from patrons. They come from people who are in the service, come from people who are listening to our books every day, and from people who, you know, realize that every patron is a critical person in our program, you know, and we really appreciate all of their continued support.
okay.
I would also just like to add, in terms of accessibility, it's also to make materials financially accessible to
yeah, good
people.
point.
That NLS functions for the blind and print disabled in the same way that the regular library functions for sighted readers. You may not be able to afford to buy a book, but you or I can go to the library and check it out and read it and bring it back without it costing us anything. And it's the same for blind and print disabled readers. Sure, you can get it from Audible, but you have to pay for it. Whereas if you're an NLS patron,
really good
it
point.
comes to you free. And I've met a lot of patrons at library events around the country, and you know, many of them are lower income, and the program allows them, I mean, it opens up the world to them without them having to pay to access the reading material.
Yeah. One thing that you reminded me, I wanted to mention this, in the, especially in the 1930s, when the NLS would do a talking book with a living author, they would often bring in that author not to do the whole book, but to read the introduction or the first page or two. You brought with you Eleanor Roosevelt's autobiography. Well, the first disc is Eleanor Roosevelt talking to you.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of that, and again, we want to credit American Foundation for the Blind for pursuing that. You know, through the partnership that we had with them, you know, they were taking this very seriously. We were going to provide audiobooks, and they were going to be good, right? And they were going to be interesting, and we have a lot of that. I mean, we always get sort of excited. You know, we have all of these records, and I brought a bunch of them, but not as many as we have in our basement.
Big basement.
But, you know, you can sort of sort through there, and there are these gems, as you point out, where, you know, and again, it's sort of like what Alice is talking about, what we're doing now. It's going that extra mile to make sure that that people who are blind were not getting a second, level experience. They were getting the best. So again, the selection of the materials that we were making, bringing people in and so on and so forth. I don't know whether it's the next slide or not, but there is, there's our talking book reproducer.
Yep.
Yeah.
On the table where
It's on
you
the
walked
table
in.
out there. I have to say, it is heavy, but it is stunning. It is beautiful. So, that's right,
very
exactly.
fragrant.
We were just admiring it a little while ago. Very attractive. I know that this is very small, but this is what's called talking book titles. This is from 36, 37. It's a list of the books that were produced and circulating at that point. I believe that there are some of those that it does note who the narrator is.
Yeah.
But I have to say that we still actually produce a publication digitally and in audio and in Braille called Talking Book Topics. So ever since 36, we've continued announcing what our titles are.
There was a question over here.
You mentioned innovations in technology and all, and right now, in our commercial side of the industry, there's a lot of debate, AI or not.
Oh, yeah.
How does the library feel about moving towards AI voices, or do you continue to want to maintain a relationship to human read books?
So when you say AI, you mean like text-to-speech or synthetic speech?
Artificial intelligence, yeah.
Sure.
It's gotten even more ridiculous.
Okay. I have a feeling I know how you feel about it. Well,
I know how I feel.
I'm sitting right next to Laura, so I have to be careful. But I think that at least right now, and I'll just talk about like right now what the library is thinking, at least what the National Library Service is thinking in the collections division, is that there's no real replacement for human voice narration. The experience is, meant to be a story that's read, and especially, there's a lot of stories that just don't lend themselves to synthetic speech. Now, there is a place for synthetic speech in the world. It's a tremendous technology. It is opening doors and changing things for people all over, all the time. Things that need to be timely. Let's say it's a magazine. Let's say it's a newspaper. Let's say it's something that is going to be, it's not a book. It's not a novel. I think that there's a place for synthetic speech in narrating those kind of more ephemeral materials so that they could become available more quickly. But I think the decision needs to be thought through really well.
I think the minute you cross the Rubicon, you've crossed the Rubicon.
It could be, but I
Well,
think we've crossed.
And I'm
Turns
gonna.
I
out.
don't think you have.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
we, the larger we, perhaps.
I actually want to pass this off to Laura, but I do want to say, our former director at NLS, who just recently retired, when we would have these conversations, she would say, no one wants to hear a computer read a romance to them. And I think that was,
special
exactly, and this is a very special computer. But it is important, again, because we are trying to make a really fantastic experience.
Exactly.
And so as Alice pointed out, we see places for it because we're always interested in accessibility and moving forward, but this is important to us. But I want to ask Laura what she...
What I think, well,
And you can hear her voice, exactly. That's right, she's going to be like, I love AI, absolutely.
If you could do
I think the
voiceover.
place for AI would be reading, those lists of dates, those appendix materials in the back of the book that I have read many of over the years, where it's like 20 pages of bibliography, yay. But the challenge is, whereas I will look up the French and the German names and pronounce them correctly.
Right.
I don't know if you've ever listened in looking for pronunciation. There's a wonderful website called forvo.com where people will upload a pronunciation. And the Forvo pronunciations are usually a human being saying the name. But there are other websites like How to Pronounce or Pronounce It, blah, blah, blah. And they're often the AI voice that will say, the name is Laura Gaianarelli. And it's like, yeah, okay, that's not how I say my name, but that's how the computer says my name. I just narrated the supplementary material for a huge long book about ACT UP New York, the LGBT activist organization. And at the end of the book, there were 4 pages of the oral history interviews with all the participants. It's a fabulous database. And luckily, I found the database on the ACT UP website and spent 2 hours listening. And God bless the author, because she started each interview with, please say your name,
Oh, yeah.
where we are, what day is it, and how old you are. And of course, most of these guys and gals were like, why do you want to know how old I am?
Laura needs to know.
But they said their names. But I did that research. AI would not. AI would say the name just any old way. And that's a compromise you make when you cross that Rubicon. The artificial intelligence, you can teach it certain things, but you have to load that in on the front end, and that takes time. I mean, certainly for storytelling, I'm not a fan. Even for nonfiction, I'm not a fan, because when I read a nonfiction book, I am the author, and I think Michael would say the same thing. When I'm reading nonfiction, this is my book, this is my story, and I need you to hear about Abraham Lincoln or Charlotte Bronte, and this is vital stuff. And the AI voice doesn't have that need to communicate that a human being does.
And I'm going to say that for anybody who wants to see this in action, a number of our narrators are going to be here in the Coolidge Auditorium
This evening,
from
starting at 7.
9.
Yes.
And I've been in some of those walkthroughs, and it's just amazing to hear. So you can definitely tell about the commitment of the narrators and how they bring our talking books to life. And it makes a big difference, and it makes a big difference for listeners. So
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. That's the accessibility moment, because you're accessing all of that.
Yeah, and speaking of time, I think
Oh,
we're getting
no.
close to time here, but I want to see if, I see some questions, so.
Well, it isn't years ago, about
I've got a chair for you
7
here.
years ago, I narrated a book called Galatea 2.2, and the whole focus of the book was, could you develop a computer program that could approximate human speech? And the number of programs, the computing power that you need to decipher is astronomical, because by the shores of Gumi, by the shining deep sea, how do you know, there's a whole difference, how does the computer know?
There's a microphone for you.
To make that happen. And the computing power that goes, the neural pathways that we form are still being explored, and it's right now, maybe it will be eventually, they'll develop the computers that can do that, but right now it is so far beyond what we can do that you're not going to be able to achieve that.
Anyone else? Hey,
For
are
those
we
of you
close
who
to
don't-
11?
We are 5 minutes out. I was just
Okay.
going to say, for those of you who don't know, this is Michael Kramer,
Oh,
who is
yes.
also
Yes.
one of our narrators.
Award-winning narrator.
Yeah, award-winning.
Live tonight on our stage.
Exactly. So, yeah, that's why he and Laura sound so much better than
I
Alice
know,
and
exactly.
That's right.
It's not just about saying words, it's how you say the words, it turns out. There's
Turns
more
out-
to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. If there are no other questions, I want to close. I have a short clip. It'll take me a moment to cue it up. I'll play this for you and I'll
Talk
introduce
amongst
it.
yourselves.
Right,
So-
exactly.
Talk among yourselves.
Laura, we'll leave that one to you. The talking. You and Michael could do a duet.
Well, while he's queuing that up, I guess I'll share. Anybody who's seen the film Places in the Heart?
Oh, yes.
And John Malkovich, who is the blind character in that, I remember when I first saw the film, how thrilled I was that he was listening to a talking book. He had his record player,
Really?
and he was listening to a talking book. And in fact, I think the little girl messes with his machine, and he gets really upset. Then they make friends, of course. But that was in the 30s, and he had his quote-unquote portable talking book machine that when he was farmed out to live at Sally Field's house, he took his machine with him, and that was a a Library of Congress talking book player.
Wow,
Wow, neat.
that's very cool. I did not know that.
So on the screen now, we have a picture of Mary Margaret McBride. I'm just curious, how many people know who Mary Margaret McBride was? Okay, one? One and a, one and a half? Okay, well, Mary, not to make fun of her because she's a very important person. Mary Margaret McBride was a broadcaster from the 30s into the 50s. In many ways, she's comparable to Oprah Winfrey. She had that level of popularity, that level of influence, and was really, beloved in the same way. And she had a, easygoing style on the radio that was very appealing, and she was a daily presence in homes. And she would talk to writers and other people about various things, but she would also discuss items from the news. And she would do this at length, because as you hear, it's a very conversational style. So here she is talking about the Talking Book program in 1936, and this is from the recorded sound collection down in Culpeper. If I've done this right, let's see. Let's see if I can get that to play. There we go.
Because these records must be played very slowly, that is, on the low speed. Not every blind person, I'm sorry to say, has been able to afford the machines, for they're a little expensive, so most of them have to go to reading rooms in order to hear those books. But at this moment, and I think this is news, the American Foundation has been given government funds to manufacture 5,000 of those machines. They're being made in wholesale lots, and the blind will get them at cost, and that's very low. Isn't that fine? Oh, I think that's wonderful. The Foundation has 32 readers, and most of them are radio announcers. Only 10 are women. I started to tell you about the woman, Ethel Everett. Did you ever know her?
No, I don't believe I did.
She did Jane, I never know whether it's Jane Eyre, isn't it?
Jane Eyre, yes.
Jane Eyre. And that, did I say that's the longest novel that's yet been done, Jane Eyre? I had somewhere the record of how many records that, let's see, I think it took 34 double-faced records. The records are 15 minutes long. The demand for classics has been so great that practically every play of Shakespeare's has been recorded, most of Dickens and Thackeray's books, much of Sir Walter Scott, and in a short time they'll have poetry. Keats and Tennyson and Shelley and Wordsworth, isn't that nice, and Byron. And all of the New Testament of the Bible has been recorded. Now they're starting on the Old Testament. And they've even recorded a play, Journey's End. Isn't that interesting?
And she's saying that 1936, barely 2 years into the program, and that's all that had been accomplished to that point, which is quite impressive. So,
Great. That's
well,
amazing. Thank you.
thank you. Oh, that's her radio audience.
World.
Yeah, she was she was heard nationally for 20 years or more. Just like Oprah.
Oh. Did she have
Simps-
colleagues that she was talking to? Was that who?
Yeah, Vincent. I can't think of his last name. I mean, he was with her pretty much the whole way. He was sort of he was her announcer.
Okay.
He would say it's 1 o'clock in time for Mary Margaret McBride, but he was also the kind of the foil, and the straight man and all of that. But yeah, there's her collection is at the Library of Congress in the recorded sound section, and it was the basis for a biography actually about 10 or 12 years ago. So.
Great, I'm sure.
Thank you so much for
It
digging
would make a
that
great
up.
talking book.
Yeah, thank you so much for digging that up. That's awesome. We
Yeah.
didn't know that was existed.
Thank you so much. And thank our guests, Kristen, Alice, Laura.